It's 1830. The city of Sheffield was growing at a breakneck pace. Its industry of metalwork, steel and cutlery was making the city known to all as the Forge of the North. Yet while the city was growing, it was missing a vital piece of network, a railway to the rest of the country. The 85,000 or so residents watched with bated breath as the towns of Leeds and Manchester gained its own network, linking them together forever, and it was hoped that one day that it would too be connected and ready to take its exports to a much wider market. Sheffield had one glaring problem, and it was a problem that few engineers were willing to tackle. The city was blocked by vast rolling hills, especially in the south and the west. George Stephenson's appointment to the North Midland Railway gave the city hope that it would be connected. His appointment was based solely that he was able to connect Leeds with Derby, and it was hoped that a link to Sheffield would be on the cards. But Stephenson successfully argued that even he, with his vast knowledge, would see it as too much of an ask for his engines to tackle gradients such as those, leaving Sheffield high and dry and highly disappointed. This only left the city with one option for its exports: canals. Sheffield had a canal built into the town centre in 1819, which was rather late by canal network standards. But using the canal network was painfully slow, so slow in fact that the goods would take about a week to get from Sheffield to Manchester. In 1831, thanks to pressure from the residents and the loss of revenue from faster exports from Europe, a railway linking Sheffield to Manchester was finally proposed. It was ambitious to say the least. It called for using ropes and pulleys to get the engines over the Sheaf Valley, a 1 in 32 hill, race down the other side into a 3-mile tunnel, and then go up Rush Hope Edge with more aid from standing engines. The engineers who proposed the idea were none other than George and Robert Stephenson. Those in the industry were shocked that two passionate advocates for steam locomotives would put their names to a project that would only work with the use of machines they openly opposed to using. But the men stood firm and concluded that there was simply no other way. On the 23rd of August 1831, the proposal had reached the ears of Parliament and it was approved, making it the first railway that would ever cross the Pennines. But the hills proved too much for the Stephensons, and the project was plagued with engineering problems and over-budget solutions. Finally, by 1833, they admitted defeat and abandoned the project without a single rail being laid. Sheffield was getting desperate. The steel industry was expanding thanks to the links between Manchester and Lancashire. The coal industry was booming and coal was moving at a much faster rate than ever before. Sheffield's steel business was hungry, and the coal brought in by boat was simply not quick enough to satisfy its hunger. It needed a railway. It might have been because of the disaster with the North Midland and its failure to produce a railway. Rather than trust any other collective railway company, it was decided that two committees be formed to get Sheffield finally connected with Manchester. One committee would be based in Sheffield, one in Manchester. Both would be tasked with setting up each end of the line before meeting in the middle. The directors decided that both committees collectively had to approve any decision before it was implemented, making it a bureaucratic and laborious way to get things done. The overseer of this arrangement and the man tasked with making everyone get along was Lord Warncliffe. I personally do not envy this man's job. It's a challenge to get one committee to universally agree to something, but to have two of them and to agree together, well, it takes a special type of human. The line proposed was markedly different to the one proposed by the Stephensons. It would climb up Don Valley, then through Penistone, then cross the Pennines, before descending to the low-level moors nearer to Manchester. The only real protests came from the newly inhabited town of Glossop. They were not happy that the new line did not include a through line for them, especially the mill owners. The mill owners were especially problematic, as they all came from one family and 5 of them were on the Manchester Committee themselves. The line was a little over a mile away and would have meant some serious tweaking and crossing hills to accommodate. As a compromise, a rich duke who had heard of the argument offered his land nearby and built a private branch line just off the main line and into the town. The angry millers appeased, the railway got to work with the big problem: how to cross the Pennines. 2 proposals were eventually commissioned. One from Irishman Charles Vignolis, who had favoured steep gradients and a tunnel at the top of the hills, so the tunnel length was limited, and Joseph Locke, who proposed a 3-mile tunnel to help keep the gradients low. It was decided to go ahead with Locke's plan, but they placed Charles as the engineer. It was a decision that many would soon regret. The proposed tunnel itself presented its own challenges. Not only would this be one of the longest tunnels proposed by the railway at the time, it would also be one of the most challenging due to the terrain. George Stephenson, who was still smarting from the failed railway, remarked that if ever a steam locomotive ever passed through it, he would eat it. Once again, the plan was approved by Parliament and the 41-mile line was finally underway. A new company was formed for the project, the Sheffield, Ashton-under-Lyne and Manchester Railway. It wasn't a harmonious partnership, with the secretary quitting just after the company started and people bickering about everything, even down to the company logo containing the dreaded Yorkshire Rose. In 1838, bad economic times and low cash flow meant cutbacks for the Woodhead Tunnel, and the plans were modified for a single track instead of a double one, and the project was delayed. Finally, the first cut was made, and the building finally began. The work was undertaken by navvies, but it was quickly established that the 13 tents provided by the company were not going to withstand the harsh weather the Pennines threw at them, and the men demanded more permanent dwellings as well as shops and access roads. But nothing was provided, and the men were forced to fend for themselves in bitter conditions. It was another year before their cries were heard and roads and buildings were erected. By the time the navvies had their buildings, Charles had had enough and was done with the project and the company. In a bizarre turn of events, Charles bought a rather large number of shares within the company on a less than legal basis, but then found himself in financial trouble. The directors did not like this one bit, and he was sent swiftly packing along with the chairman. The company was now in big trouble. With no engineer and no chairman, they needed help. The company turned back to Joseph Locke, and with some humbling persuasion, and probably an insane amount of grovelling I expect, managed to get him back on board. Joseph was delighted to have his idea back and was able to set his own terms on his own project. In turn, he was able to hire sub-engineers, such as renowned engineer Thomas Brassey, so he wouldn't need to be constantly on site, which is a good thing for him as he had other projects he was seeing to. The Yorkshire MP, John Parker, took up the mantle of chairman. The people of Sheffield were relieved as Parker was the MP for their city, and they knew with him at the helm, the project would finally be completed. By 1841, the shareholders were getting restless with the project. It was 4 years old, and it still wasn't completed. To add further insult to injury, in the time the railway had been bickering, the Summit Tunnel had been completed and was a direct competition to their own. It was a roundabout route from Sheffield to Manchester, and things were not always smooth, but it was a route, and a profitable one at that. It would take a further 3 years and the completion of 2 viaducts, then the railway finally reached the western mouth of the Woodhead Tunnel, and still the tunnel was incomplete. For navvies, life at the Woodhead was torturous. The improved dwellings are mere stone huts with a single fireplace where up to 20 men at a time would huddle up and keep warm. There was no running water or sanitation, and there was little in the way of food. Work in the tunnel, like in any running project, was done from either end. Like the Summit Tunnel, shafts were dug down. The men would dig these shafts out at either sides and shore up the walls. Eventually, all the dug out parts of the shafts would link together, creating the tunnel. The conditions were disgusting. Men were forced to tread in knee-deep mud and were forced to lick brown, stagnant water off the walls to quench their thirst. Diseases ran rife through the camps, and with no toilets, it made living there unbearable. Navvies didn't just have to contend with the appalling living conditions. Injury and death were common in the tunnels. Broken limbs and limb losses were common due to rockfalls and misuse of gunpowder. If the men survived the surgery, as many died from shock due to the lack of pain relief and anaesthetic, then they would be placed in the warmest place the railway had, the boiler houses. It was warm, but that's all it had. They had noisy, filthy places with water coming in through the roof. The rate that these injuries were occurring were quite frankly staggering. In the years that the tunnel had been worked on, over 600 men had been injured and 32 had lost their lives. The railway would blame part of these injuries due to the men turning up drunk after payday. But in reality, while there was drunken fights in the streets and the police were called on a number of occasions, the majority of these injuries were caused by the working conditions. Despite the conditions, the navvies were paid rather well compared to other men working on the railways, and money was set aside for a school for the children and men who had become ill or injured. But as long as the funds were there, the men worked hard, even on the Sabbath day, much to the missionaries' horror. In 1845, a report was made into the working conditions of the Woodhead Tunnel and heavily criticised the railway. The railway refused to accept the findings, citing that the men themselves were causing the injuries with their lack of care. One contractor openly named disreputable workers and how he had helped delivering wholesome foods to be brought in. The contractor concluded that there was never a public work more respectfully conducted. The local news reporters were harder to convince. One newspaper, the Manchester Guardian, set up a select committee to look at the conditions of the workers, while the government, hearing of the news, decided to set up its own committee. The report documented over 200 pages of failings, of which nothing was done. In effect, the general consensus was that these workers were drunk hooligans, which the railway fed them ale and rotten beef. It was cruel, but hardly anyone connected to the railway or otherwise did anything to help. 1845 saw the completion of the Woodhead Tunnel, and the line was completed from Sheffield as far as Penistone. Some news outlets hailed the tunnel as a triumph of art over nature and as the greatest piece of engineering work ever conceived. As the work was completed, the navvies moved on to other projects, but more than 300 remained, and the company celebrated their success with a grand feast on the 22nd of December, the likes of which none of them had ever seen. The success, though, also belonged to Sheffield. It finally had a direct route to Manchester. The committee chairman congratulated the railway and toasted to its many successes. But the toast seemed a hollow victory. In just 7 months, the company was gone. The line was merged, and in 1846 it became a part of the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway. There were many, many shares that Charles had bought earlier had now come back to bite him hard. With the dissolvement of the company, the shares were merely scraps of paper with pretty words and worth less than a penny. The new railway had its feet barely on the ground before it began to encounter its first real problem. The new line and tunnel was proving to be too popular. Remember the single line through the tunnel to cut costs? That line now became a bottleneck. To prevent the head-on collision, a pilot engine would guide trains through the tunnel, but at the tunnel's mouth it was a practical traffic jam. It took less than 2 years to decide that a second tunnel was going to have to be dug. Theoretically, this should have been an easier job, as the original shafts dug down from the surface included side arches, which could be opened in case a second tunnel was needed, and the workers could easily open these arches and set to work. Lessons had also been learned about the working conditions, and the men were more closely monitored by the clergy at the nearby town of Penistone. Thanks to the progress, the men were given a week off. However, they contracted cholera on their return. The epidemic ran swiftly round the camp from man to man, with 28 succumbing to the disease. After this, and coupled with the terrible treatment when the first tunnel was built, the men considered the Woodhead to be cursed. It was a reputation the Woodhead Tunnel would fail to shake, even after the tunnel's second completion in 1852, when even drivers referring to the tunnels as the hellholes. The tunnels held right up for 100 years, when a plan was introduced to electrify the lines. The twin boreholes were too small for electrical cables, so a third tunnel was commissioned. By now, British Railway had taken ownership, and 100 years of innovation would help construct this longer tunnel, but it wasn't without challenge. Part of the tunnel collapsed twice, so it was reinforced with rib arches and reinforced concrete. The tunnel was not without its dangers either, and 6 people lost their lives constructing it. But it was completed in a mere 2 years and opened in 1954. Tunnel 3 would take all the work from Tunnel 1 and 2. National Grid, seeing the 2 tunnels now fallow and filling up with water, decided to lay new electricity cables through them, permanently putting the hellholes out of use. The thick black soot was blasted away and the rails were lifted. Thick concrete was poured where ballast once stood. Oil-filled pressure tubing would house the cables, which were laid in water troughs, and a narrow-gauge railway was built for ease of access. In Tunnel 2, oil tanks and ducting were fitted, and everything was running by 1970. Even something this new and modern would still fall down to the beaching axe. In 1963, Beeching recommended that all passenger services should stop and the line be exclusively used for freight. The Minister of Transport amazingly refused to back the plan, so Beeching turned his gaze to the communities that the Woodhead Tunnel served. The public sang an outcry that their lines were going to be cut, but Beeching and British Rail stood firm. It was either the passenger services or the communities. The people chose the former, and the last passenger train to head through the Woodhead Tunnel went through on the 4th of January 1969. The freight work held out for 27 years before being withdrawn completely in 1981. The campaigners against the closure of the tunnels were down, but not out. Even though the twin tunnels were being used for cabling, there was still hope in getting them restored, but the campaigners were met with many obstacles. Old Victorian tunnels were becoming dangerous, and a cave-in in the down tunnel blocked the tunnel completely. It was repaired and shored up, but both tunnels would suffer from fire within years of each other. Coupled with the oil and the equipment, simply wasn't safe. Campaigners looked at the 1953 tunnel as a possibility of getting the rail link operational again. The National Grid contemplated the idea and asked the Department of Transport what the viability would be to get the line back on track. As the Department of Transport had no plans to get the tunnel into operation, National Grid moved in and moved their cablings from Tunnels 1 and 2 into Tunnel 3. The twin Victorian tunnels were then sealed forever with concrete and left to their fates. Tunnels 1 and 2 may be closed, but there are still remnants of its railway past. The impressive entrances can still be seen, and although the trackbed has gone many years ago, you can still walk part of the route with the westbound end of the tunnel still sporting a platform alluding to the tunnel's long past. It may not be the end of the Woodhead story. There are calls to reinstate it, and campaigners have been given more incentive with the Beeching Reversal Act. Hopefully, who knows? Maybe one day the tunnels will hear the mighty roar of the railway's engines once again.